Hey everybody, I'm here with Alex Penk, CEO and big boss leader of Ethos New Zealand. He's a dear friend and we've spoken on conferences together, and I thought that he has amazing wisdom to share with us here in Singapore. And so Alex, brief impressions about Singapore. Have you ever been?
I've never been to Singapore, so all I know is what I've seen from the airplane landing there and taking off in transit.
Very good. So impressions then of someone who's heard about Singapore, perhaps transited through, but never actually been. Impressions.
New Zealand actually pays quite a lot of attention to Singapore. And, we're both small island nations.
Yes.
And so every now and then New Zealand policymakers look to Singapore and say, well, what can we learn from their success? So my impression is it's a successful nation. It's one that has made a lot of progress in decades past and is still on a really positive track.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear that actually, because I do believe so as well. I mean, I think we've got a wonderful leadership, a great bureaucracy that has kept things running very efficiently. And one of the stellar points of our leadership is that we've got a technocratic leadership. So they make decisions on the basis of data. They don't make it on whim. And so, yeah, I think that contributes definitely to the efficiency with which you are seeing Singapore run. Now, I'd like to talk to you about some of the things that are perhaps happening in Singapore for a long time, or maybe on the cards for Singapore as we move into the future. The issue of life is something that stirs a lot of emotions. Radical individualists would feel that the sanctity of life comes second to our will for our life, how we want our bodies to be used, and what our wills are as adults. Now, Singapore has one of the most radical abortion policies in the world. If I'm not wrong, we're top 7 in the world when it comes to the term limits. We allow for abortions up to 24 weeks. Ladies over 14 don't need to ask for parental consent when it comes to having abortions. And on top of that, if I did the math right, we're possibly approaching about 700,000 abortions since it was legalized about 50 plus years ago. There are no official statistics, so these are estimates, but I think that they are decent estimates. Now, how does New Zealand handle the issue of life? Do you think it's handled more responsibly or less responsibly? And what do you generally think about Singapore's position?
It sounds to me like quite a similar kind of position. So the point you made at the start, the understanding of what is a person, what level of autonomy or responsibility do we have for our own bodies, and for those who are unborn. I would say our cultural understanding in New Zealand sounds quite similar. Quite similar to yours.
Western mindset.
So I mean, essentially it's the idea that we are autonomous, literally a law unto ourselves. We create our own sense of meaning, we create our own identity and our own purpose. And therefore, the common phrase in New Zealand, you do you, I'll do me. If that's right for you, you speak your truth. Those sort of ideas.
We're familiar with that rhetoric in Singapore.
Oh, well, I'm sorry to hear that, but
So it's a bad thing, I'm reckoning, this idea of radical individualism.
Well, I think so, because fundamentally I think it's out of step with what human beings are actually like. I mean, I think, every single person has dignity. We're made for relationship, so we exist in relationships of solidarity, mutual dependence, mutual obligation. We come into the world as part of a web of unchosen commitments and obligations and relationships. And so I think we actually need to live in accordance with that. Our law and our policy should reflect the reality of what it actually is to be human. And the kind of individualism that we see in so many countries in the West, I think is actually out of step with that. There's a solid idea, which is that all of us should have moral agency, the ability to make important decisions, but along with that you have to have the wisdom to know what is worth choosing. Yes,
and also the corresponding responsibilities that come with our moral agency.
Exactly.
And so perhaps on the issue of life, the idea of my body, my choice, do you feel that that's a valid statement? Do you feel that that's valid rhetoric? Or do you feel that there ought to be nuance attached to it?
I mean, I think there has to be nuance attached to it because in some settings that makes sense. For example, if you're talking about the ability to refuse medical treatment that you yourself don't want. There's an important protection there against, for example, the power of the state or the power of social expectation or pressure. But when you're talking about something that actually involves the interests of another person, which is fundamentally what pregnancy does, then it's suddenly a different calculation. And we often, in New Zealand, perhaps from what you've said in Singapore as well, we often take these concepts that sort of make sense within one setting and then apply them reductively in another setting without thinking about, what is the principle or the idea behind this concept that gives it real meaning, the why for it, and does that why still apply in this different context?
So flesh this out a little bit for me. What exactly is the why in the question of life?
Well, I think to me the why is that life is a gift and life is a good thing, and life is something that we receive, and it's something that we should treasure and we should steward responsibly. That's true for ourselves. That's true for our relationship with others, starting with our families, our friends, our communities, our nation, and so I think when I think about situations in which my body, my choice makes sense, where you might have a right to refuse medical treatment, for example. In a sense, that's saying, yep, you are responsible for your own body. You're responsible for your life because you are the one that received that gift. Yeah. But the situation changes when there's more than one life. Involved. Yeah. And of course, even when we're talking about something like medical treatment, there always has to be a recognition we're not isolated individuals. We always exist. So if I refuse medical treatment, they may have implications for my family or society at large. So we always have to be thinking in terms of our interdependence.
Life exists as a continuum from conception till death. Many people think it's birth, but indeed it is actually 9 months, even 10 months before birth. That's where life begins. Now, towards the end of the continuum, narratives have emerged in the West. I think New Zealand has dealt with this as well.
We have.
This idea of euthanasia. It goes by many euphemisms. It goes by medically assisted dying, compassionate death, stuff like that. Now, what's New Zealand's experience been, and what lessons can Singapore learn from that?
Yeah. So we introduced euthanasia and assisted suicide in 2021. So they have been available procedures for a little over 3 years now. Wow. For anybody who's listening who's not familiar with the terminology, euthanasia is when a doctor kills a patient. Assisted suicide is when the patient administers the medication to themselves.
Why would that even need to be a difference if it was morally ambiguous, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, a really interesting thing that you see in practice, as you may well know, is that in jurisdictions that have both of those available, the vast majority of deaths are by euthanasia, not assisted suicide. So people are far more likely to do this if a doctor is able to kill them rather than they have to kill themselves. And
what does that say?
I think that tells you something quite interesting. We're sort of hardwired not to take our own lives. I think is that what that tells you. Also, it means that if you get euthanasia into a country, you are going to see more deaths and you're going to see a higher rate of death. I think is what we can expect. There's something comforting about the medical professional doing it, rather than you taking the pills yourself, for example. So we've had this for about 3 years now, and so far we're seeing what you would have expected, which is that when the law was passed, we were told, the law will be as it is. It's not going to expand. Stop scaremongering by talking about the way it's expanded in all these other countries.
Okay.
And of course now we have a campaign to expand the law, to reduce doctors' conscience rights, to reduce the conscience rights of hospice, care homes, rest home facilities, and so on, who are looking after people who are sick and towards the end of their life. And I think we are likely to see the expansion of the law and an increase in the number of deaths.
In Canada, if I remember correctly, it is now the leading cause of death, or one of them. And
it's certainly one of them. I think it's over 4, may even be 5% of all deaths.
Wow, incredible. And I also understand that initial promises were made that there would be a very limited scope in that setting. And then it's now been expanded to even include self-diagnosed mental illness or psychological discomfort with life. Do you see that this expansionist tendency is really afoot in New Zealand?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not familiar with the Canadian. The aspects that you've just outlined, but certainly what you can see is there's an underlying idea of what it is to be human, and it's the logic of that idea that it means it's inevitable that these regimes will expand, because the basic idea is that nobody should have to suffer. We should be in control of everything that we possibly can be in control of. Once that's the understanding, once that's the mindset, there's no real reason to sort of draw a line somewhere and then say, well, that's it for all time and forever, definitively.
Yeah.
So, for example, in New Zealand, we have a limit of around terminal illness with a prognosis of 6 months to live.
Yeah.
So the campaign is now to remove that.
Yeah.
And of course, in a sense, that's logical. Why draw a line at 6 months? And then how do you justify saying to somebody, your prognosis is 7 months?
Right. So if life is not objectively valuable,
exactly,
then the slippery slope immediately applies.
Yeah, and if your understanding is that people, the most important thing about being a person is that you can choose whatever you want, you have everything on your terms, then there is no reason to put barriers in place around that.
So this is the autonomy conversation making its way into the euthanasia discussion, such that. But so here's the interesting thing about the slippery slope. We're often told that it's a myth.
Yes.
We're often told that it's fear-mongering, exactly like what you said, right?
Yeah.
Now, in your experience, why is it that the slippery slope is a myth? It's often a card played when conservatives have warned about the ultimate consequences of a thing.
Yes.
Why is that often the first card that a liberal would play?
Yeah, to say that it's a fallacy. Yeah. I mean, I think because it is possible, in theory, for people to scaremonger, for people to say things will happen that won't, to say that the sky will fall, etc. The thing is, I don't really see anybody doing that. Certainly, I don't think that was happening when we had the euthanasia debate in New Zealand. People were making responsible, reasoned arguments, backed up by evidence, backed up by the experience of other countries, backed up by logic. But nonetheless, it's an easy way to try and discredit what people are saying.
Yes.
So we had people say, look, it's just not going to happen because we're different somehow. And it's never really explained why what's happened in all these other countries wouldn't happen here. So I would say, look at what you see overseas and just think, if it's happened everywhere else, why on earth wouldn't it happen here?
So if we were to grant the benefit of the doubt to our interlocutor, we would say you're probably very naive about what you're advocating for. But if we didn't grant the benefit of the doubt, we would say you're being dishonest, because the case studies that have gone before have all universally shown that the slippery slope is a reality, not a myth. Yeah.
I think the most charitable way of understanding it is, when we've engaged with and debated people who have been on the other side of this issue, they genuinely want something they believe is good. They're genuinely motivated by compassion and a particular idea of dignity. I think it's the wrong idea of dignity. I think it's the wrong idea of compassion. But I think that we can see that, and perhaps we can even look for common ground to say, you don't want to see people suffering. We don't want to see people suffering either. Can we make common cause on things like the importance of palliative care?
Yes.
The importance of resourcing families to be able to care for their sick, for their elderly, so that they feel like they have options and they're not burdened. Now, I don't want to sort of to pick up on the word you use, I don't want to naively overstate the case and say, we can all hold hands and agree on these things.
Sure.
But I think that's that's sort of the best version of the opposing argument that I've seen. There is actually a concern to avoid suffering. And yes, sometimes that does lead people to be naive about the overseas experience, or even to sort of engage in motivated reasoning, selective use of the facts, and so on. And when that happens, I think we do need to call that out.
Yeah. Can death be a dignified experience? Because death is very often seen as undignified, the suffering, the gasping for air. It's not visually pleasing to see a loved one go through something like that. What would one say to articulate the idea that ordinary death and ordinary suffering, extreme as it may be, is a natural thing that ought to be cared for and safeguarded as part of the human experience, as opposed to avoided? How would one make that argument?
Well, I think all you've got to do is listen to the testimony, the experience of people who actually care for people at the end of their lives. So when we were having this debate around euthanasia in New Zealand, the organisation I worked for at the time, we brought a palliative care expert, Dr. Catherine Mannix, out to New Zealand, who was actually able to speak into the public debate and say, this is what natural death and this is what natural dying looks like. For various reasons, most of us are no longer familiar with what death and dying look like. But in fact,
the ugly things that we keep.
We hear things. And we hear things about them that scare us. But actually, in the vast majority of cases, it's an entirely natural, peaceful process that we don't actually need to be afraid of. And she was very good at explaining that even those sort of things, what we might interpret as somebody sounding like they're in pain. They might sound like they're moaning. They might sound like they're gasping for breath. This is actually a natural part of the process, and the person going through these things isn't actually in pain.
Unconscious.
In fact, it's just she's a doctor. I'm not, but she was very good at explaining this is actually just the natural process. This part
physiological reflex.
This part of the body is doing this. The person is not actually distressed.
Yes.
The most distressed person is the family member who's hearing this, who doesn't know what's going on. So I would say there's actually lots of good evidence and testimony that we can draw on. And then if you do have the experience of going through this, and I've seen this with family members, of actually a beautiful, dignified, natural end to life is entirely possible.
Alex, a final word to Singapore, if you will, about your experience, a word of advice around the issue of life and of euthanasia, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's fundamentally that life is a gift. It's a beautiful and a precious thing, and we should celebrate that for as long as we can, and as long as you can in law and policy, make sure that value is upheld.
Alex, thank you very much for your time.
So good to talk with you.
Super appreciate this, man.